Hello, everyone. Today I will be starting a new series on learning how to chart. For the entirety of this series and for basically all my YouTube videos, I'll be using TradingView, but you can use pretty much any sort of charting platform as you please. All right, let's go ahead and dive right into this. Lesson number 1 will be about resistances and supports. So let me start with explaining what resistances are. Resistances are typically where the stock has hit a few times but historically rejected. The perfect example of this is, imagine you have a tennis ball in your hand and you're just throwing it at the ceiling. There are two outcomes of this. One, it hits the ceiling and bounces down, or the ball will rip through the ceiling and potentially keep going up. It's the same concept for stocks. A stock will hit the resistance or ceiling and have two possible outcomes. The first option is that it rejects the resistance and it comes down, or it breaks the resistance and it can push further up. Now let's look at how we can actually identify the resistance based off the charts. Typically what you want to look for are a minimum of 3 pivot points, right? So I see a pivot point here, another pivot point here, and another pivot point here. So what I'm going to do is take my trend line and place it right across that bar right there. I have my trend lines and arrows favorited. If you don't have them, you can go ahead and it's all in this first tab right here. It's the trend line and arrow function. So let's understand what this actually means. So when the stock hit this resistance, it seemed as if it was just basing around and then it dropped back onto this level, bounced back up, hit the ceiling, fell back down. The same thing applies right here. Rejected, fell back down. Now notice when it finally does break, Tesla continues to push forward as it broke the resistance and continued trending up. Now let's look at a different example. Here we have shop. So as previously mentioned, we want a minimum of 3 pivot points to claim it as a resistance. So for shop, here's one, here's another, here's another one, and finally let's put one here where it's spacing around. I'm going to switch to this trend line. And when you're drawing your resistance, if you hold a shift key, it should hold it straight horizontal. This is super important because you don't want to draw your levels like this, or even if you're just trying to eyeball it, sometimes it's off. Just go ahead and hold the shift key to properly align your resistance bar. Now, let's take a look at what happens when it finally breaks resistance. When it does, you see this massive continuation all the way up to even here. Now, ideally, you'd want to wait for confirmation, right? So these small candles are typically not the ideal kind of continuation. You want one of these bigger, high volume candles, and I'll try to explain that a little bit more on maybe a different video where it's confirmation. But for right now, this video will focus on strictly just understanding where the resistance is and how to draw it. So when I talk about pivot points for resistances, they do not have to be drastic up and down movements, right? So notice how these wicks over here have been basing around and have a hard time passing this level of a price. That's essentially what is a resistance, right? So it doesn't have to be these massive up and downs. It could just as easily be basing around. And what you're ideally looking for is a potential break uptrend for a continuation play. So it doesn't have to be super drastic, but the key is as many times as you see a candle hitting a certain level is a good indicator of what a resistance is. Okay, so now that we've gone over what resistances are, let's talk about supports. Supports are essentially the same thing except the inverse. So instead of the ceiling, you're looking at the floor now. So from our previous example of the tennis ball, imagine you're bouncing it on the floor. right? So there's still two options. It either bounces back up towards you or it breaks the floor and it keeps falling down. That's essentially what supports are. Um, when you're looking at this line, right, I see a pivot point there, another one here, and another one potentially right there. So what I'm going to do is take my trend line, take the bottommost point. Sometimes it's the wicks, sometimes it's the end of the candle, and I'm going to draw a line going down this way. Now, notice how this point right here isn't directly on this line, and that's okay. The key for this is you just want to see where it pivots, right? So although it didn't hit this line directly, it still bounced back up and hit this resistance that we previously had drawn. Now, the reason I drew my line here versus here is because I'd want to stay safe and pick the bottommost point. Now, look what happens when it it finally breaks the support, right? It keeps coming down, right? So this is the move that we're looking for. Now, there's plenty of times where it'll hit the support and bounce back up to resistance, and that's totally fine. That's why you kind of want to wait for the confirmation and then play the downtrend. So let's look at another example here. So I want to identify where the pivot points are, right? So I see one here. Let's call this one there. I'll turn on my favorites so it's a little bit quicker. Another one here and another one there. This one's got a lot, so I'll just put this in the general vicinity of it. We're gonna hit the trend line and see what fits the best, right? So I'm gonna hold my shift key and notice how the end of the candle fits a little better here. So it hits this. You got the wick of this. It does break below, but bounces right back, right? And then you have the end of this wick. This is essentially where I personally would draw it. I know it's slightly messy, but notice how when it did break, it still bounced back up. I still consider that to be within the support, right? As long as it doesn't break, it's still within it. That's what matters. Now, if I was looking at this and I start to see that, hey, look, this kind of has a resistance here. So I see a pivot point here, got another one here, you know, a few of these. And then what I would do is take what fits the best, right? So I didn't want to draw it here, right? Because it would only take out this wick. But notice how there's a wick here, there's a wick here, there's a wick everywhere. So what I'm going to do is place it right there. And I'd set that to be kind of my resistance level. Now, because it's kind of wicked before, you want to be extra cautious. But notice what happens kind of when it does break. It comes back down, gives you another chance to enter, and then it pushes back up. Now, this is just an example where the support was there and it bounced back up. But the key for this support and resistances are you don't want to make a decision on if you're going to get calls or puts based off of just the resistance and support alone, right? You want to make sure that it confirms. So if I noticed it wicked here and it bounced back up, I would say, calls to potential resistance would be fine. Now, when it broke the resistance, came back down, if it had came back into right under this resistance, my prediction would be that it would hit this support. But notice how it bounced right back up and it stayed above. That's how you know it essentially breaks the pattern. So if you're new to charting and would like to practice, my suggestion would be create a watch list right here on TradingView. Time frame doesn't really matter, but just sit there and try to figure out where the resistances and supports would be. It's pretty quick. They don't have to be exact. Just if you can identify it pretty quickly, I think it's a huge advantage, especially when the market's pretty live, right? Like you got to be kind of quick. But You could do it on the longer time frames and just sit there and go through these, because once you sit there and do it, it comes super naturally, right? As you're just going through it. Um, there are a few indicators that you can use as swing high, low, support and resistance, where oh, I already have it on, where it kind of pinpoints where the support and resistances are. Now, ideally, you want to stay away from this, because I feel like if you were to draw it, it's just better, and you have limited amount of indicators, and I think there are better indicators that you could potentially use. Um, and I'll go through over some good indicators in a different kind of video, but it's pretty quick and easy once you get the hang of it. The key is just to practice. Um, and I think that kind of concludes this video. A lot of it is just coming down to practice. I know this was my first video for this series. I hope it was kind of helpful. If you have any suggestions, go ahead and drop them in the comments, or I have a link. I'll throw my link tree in the comments as well. You could DM me on Twitter. I'm pretty responsive there. I also post Twitter charts live as the market's going on for potential plays. If that's something you're interested in, wanted to follow on, go ahead and follow me on Twitter. But I think that basically concludes this video. If you guys want to follow along, I'll be posting more videos on potential indicators, more patterns, TradingView tips. If that's something you're interested in, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.